So this session is about deploying Office 365 in production, and I'll clarify what we mean by that in a little bit. But first, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Scott Schnoll. I'm a senior content developer on the Exchange team at Microsoft. Among other things, I write a lot of the tech deck documentation for on-premises features like high availability and site resilience and virtualization and a few other areas. So I typically don't do cloud or Office 365 presentations, but I just couldn't pass up an opportunity to visit Stockholm, and so I agreed to do this session for you guys. And speaking of this session is really all about the deployment considerations that you'll need to keep in mind when you are expanding what we would call a pilot Office 365 implementation into a production deployment. And again, I'll clarify what I mean about that as we go through it. So we'll start with an overview of the deployment process, and then we'll discuss things like directory synchronization, coexistence, migration, and some of the migration options. Also, one more quick note about this deck. We do have a lot of content that we're going to be going through, but quite frankly, 2 hours is not really enough time to cover everything. But what I've done is I've put probably about 50 or 60 additional slides inside this deck that has a lot of extra information and a lot of details that we just won't have time to cover that will still be relevant and germane for you to know with respect to your deployments. The other thing is you'll find that the notes section has also been packed with the things I'm going to talk about, and a lot of links to both TechNet and other sources, so you'll have a lot of additional information at your fingertips. And again, we'll make this deck available for download, so after the event, when you get it, you'll get a lot more information than what we have time to cover today. All right, so let's start with an overview of the deployment process. So when we look at the whole process start to finish, it's really a three-stage process. And this represents the typical approach that we'll take with customers. So customers get to experience the service value early in the pilot phase. They get to evolve features when and if they need it. And they get to determine how far down that path that we're going to go. We actually have a name for this deployment process. We call it Fast Track. And you may have already heard that if you attended the Fast Track for Exchange presentation earlier yesterday. So this really, when you think about Fast Track, this really represents a major shift in how we're approaching the deployment process, both within and outside of Microsoft. If you think about the guidance that we had quite some time ago when we started out, we had a very complex path to onboarding. We were asked to do things like install ADFS, Active Directory Federation services, to do federated IDs. We wanted everybody to install at least an Exchange 2010 server so that they could do a hybrid configuration. And this ended up leaving a lot of customers with the impression that the path to getting onboarded in Office 365 was really difficult and time-consuming and required a lot of work on their part. And so this fast track process is really designed to eliminate those barriers to adoption and remove the impression that that complex path was the only way to go. Now, of course, if you want to, that path is still available, and for some customers it will be a viable deployment path for them to get onboarded. But it doesn't mean that every single customer now has to go through that same exact complex process in order to do that. So step one, as you can see here, that covers the pilot phase, and this is the phase in which you get to experience the service early. And typically it's before the rest of your entire organization does it. And this basically allows you to check out the service and see where it fits your needs. And basically the pilot is typically a small, simple group, sometimes with key stakeholders who can influence the other folks in your organization. And this really is there to enable them to evaluate Office 365 without having to make major modifications to their on-premises infrastructure, or really put in a lot of effort in trying out the service. So when we talk about the pilot process, which we're not going to really talk too deep about today, it's really not meant to be a deep proof of concept type pilot. It's really just there to allow you to try out the service and use that trial as a mechanism and input into your purchase decision-making process. So one of the key aspects when we talk about step two, the deployment phase, again, That's the blue square. That's what we're going to be focusing on in this presentation. One of the key aspects that we talk about, and there's several, and we'll go through each of these, is all about that single sign-on experience. So keep in mind that things like synchronized IDs or even the use of directory sync and our DirSync tool, that's not required for you to use Office 365. You can run on cloud IDs, you can use your vanity domains, your own custom domains for SMTP inside of Office 365, or you can, if you want, introduce a new domain in Office 365 as well. And you can do that as part of the pilot and then move forward from there. And this is especially helpful actually for customers that don't already have their own on-premises AD environment. Just out of curiosity, is anybody here running in an environment that does not have Active Directory? No one. Oh, one person. Well, sorry to single you out. If you do have on-premises AD, and not everybody has AD, but if you do have one, especially one that is populated with a large amount of information about your users, then using a tool like DirSync will allow you to synchronize that to the cloud and give you the same information across all of your directories, a unified GAL, and so forth. It also has the benefit of allowing you to do things like select users for configuring meetings in Link, and of course select users for provisioning access and access control in SharePoint as well. But again, getting back to single sign-on, when we talk about single sign-on, it's really geared towards customers that have that on-premises AD. And for those customers, they'll use DirSync to synchronize their on-prem AD to Office 365. And so the single sign-on experience is basically about your end users only having to know their already existing on-premises username and password that they can use seamlessly to access both on-premises resources and their cloud-based resources. Now, from a mail perspective, the second box, we take an approach that is basically based on your existing messaging system. So for example, if you're running Exchange 2010 with Service Pack 3 today, you've already got everything that you need for a hybrid configuration. And hybrid really only requires DirSync. It does not require Active Directory Federation services. And if you are enabling the password synchronization feature in DirSync, which is relatively new, maybe 6 to 8 months old now, then you get the single sign-on experience. And of course, hybrid also enables you to do things like move mailboxes seamlessly in an online fashion, and while still using the same OST file, because the GUID gets preserved for that mailbox as it's moved from on-premises to the cloud, and do things like share FreeBusy information cross-premises as well. Now, if you're running Exchange 2007 or Exchange 2003, there is a hybrid path that you can take. But the point of Fast Track, and really the point of this presentation, is really all about the time to value and shortening that so that you don't, again, have this long, lengthy, complex process. But there's a number of customers running these legacy versions who are interested in hybrid, and that requires a lot of work on their part. The legacy servers need to be, in some cases, updated to the required service pack. Newer versions of Exchange will need to be introduced. There may be some remediation that they need to do on the desktop, and et cetera, et cetera. And this can be, depending on the customer, this can be a very daunting and complex task for them to have to do. So for 2007, 2003 users, as you can see up there, the hybrid is really an enhanced feature. So it doesn't really fall into the step 2, the deployment phase. It really falls into what we would call step 3, which is the enhanced phase, when you're adding that extra value or doing additional things above and beyond the basic deployment tasks that it takes for you to do. And one of the reasons it's so easy is because we've done a lot of work inside our migration wizards to make things as seamless and as smooth as possible. Now, for collaboration, we recommend enabling these features in this step 2 phase. And this is going to require you to understand how you're using those features today and how you might be using them once you're on the cloud service. Now, you have to understand the segments in your organization that use these features, and you have to really know who requires certain features that are going to be enabled later on in that phase. And so for that reason, migrating a small group of users can actually give you some pretty good quick wins in terms of getting some of them up and running in the service. In other words, find those users who don't need the complete and full feature set and migrate them first, because that will make things easier for you in the long run. From a client's perspective, well, obviously we recommend deploying Office 365 Pro Plus, but that's not a requirement. We do recommend deploying that during the pilot phase, though, not necessarily in the step 2 deployment phase, because there may be some work that you need to do at the desktop in order to install Pro Plus on your user workstations. Now, if you're not going to use Pro Plus, that doesn't mean that you get out of that. And there still might be some work that you have to do at the desktop. For example, updating Office to a version that is supported by the cloud service. Now, from the mobile perspective, most devices today are already set to be able to configure with multiple endpoints. So really, that's not going to be too much of a challenge for you. Thanks to, in large part, Active Sync, I can take just about any device and configure it for accessing both a Office 365 tenant and accessing an on-premises deployment. And I don't need Windows Phone to do that. Okay, I can do that with Android, I can do that with iPhone, I can do that basically with just about any mobile device today that is supporting Exchange Active Sync. Now again though, although all of this is our recommended path, we'll talk about administration too real quick. So administration, particularly from a data control perspective. So this is where you're going to be having much deeper conversations with your IT department because some of the features, things like data loss prevention, for example, they're going to take a little bit longer for you to be able to implement them. Now again, as what I was going to say is when you look at all of these, this is our recommended deployment path, but we're not saying that everybody has to go down this path. This is what we recommend for most customers, but there will certainly be customers that will be exceptions to this recommendation, and they'll have to take a slightly different path that may be more complex and might require a bit more administrative burden on their part. But the idea behind this path is it's the simplest path for reducing the time to value and onboarding as quickly as possible. All right, some other things that are required. So let's talk about identity. So again, it looked like almost everybody in here does have an on-premises AD. And if you do have one and you want to synchronize that information, you'll need what we call a Windows Azure Active Directory DIRSync compliance. So that's kind of a mouthful, so you may hear me just say Windows Azure AD, or maybe I might just say WAAD throughout the presentation. But that's basically what we're talking about when we say that. And this DIRSync compliance, that can be deployed on a physical server, and it can also be deployed in a virtualized environment as well. Basically, any virtualization platform supported by Windows. So that means Hyper-V and any hypervisor that is listed in our server virtualization and validation program as well. So from a network perspective, you need to consider the network access from the client endpoints. So just having outbound access for ports 80 and for ports 443 might not be enough. It may be that for security reasons, your organization has chosen to do things like lock down some of that access or used some form of restrictive policies on some of their networking hardware such that you might need to revisit those policies and reduce or eliminate some of those policies in order to allow unfettered client access from their endpoints. And then in addition to that, you also need to consider network bandwidth. This is particularly true for those customers that have just a single point of ingress and egress for the internet. With that single access point, you have to make sure that you have a sufficient level of bandwidth and a low enough level of latency to shift your workloads from on-premises to a cloud-based service, which of course would all traverse through that connection point. Now, this is especially true during the data migration process, particularly if you're migrating a large amount of data, because you want to make sure that you have a sufficient level of bandwidth to not interrupt or interfere with client access while data is migrating over that same single connection point. And so this could actually dictate, knowing your network bandwidth and the needs that you have, this might actually dictate when you actually do your deployment. This might drive you to do things like do your migrations in the evenings or over weekends and things like that. You know, some off hours. All right, now we do also have this network assessment tool, and it is regionalized. And you can use that to validate your environment. There's links in, again, the notes of the slide deck. There's one for North America, there's one for the EMEA region, and one for the APAC region. And this tool, when you go to this link, it does require Java, unfortunately. It's a third-party tool that we've licensed for use in doing this. Eventually, we do have plans to integrate it into the service, but right now it is a third-party tool that we've licensed. And the way it's designed, it's actually not designed specifically for an administrator, but rather for your end users to go to this link and run the tool from the end user workstation so that the tool can do a network assessment of the bandwidth and the pathways between that client workstation and the cloud service and verify and basically tell you whether or not it thinks the network is good to go in terms of being able to use from that workstation. Now, an admin can certainly use it. They can run that tool from the servers from which they'll be migrating the data, and that will still be useful for them because they'll be able to tell whether or not there's enough bandwidth for that data to be migrated from that service. So basically, it's a tool that allows you to profile and simulate workloads. Now, we are working on some additional guidance for the tool. We don't have very much to go with it right now, but the documentation team that's working on that is working very hard on it, and I do expect to see something maybe within the next month or so. All right, so from an identity deployment perspective, again, focusing on step 2 for this session, it's really about driving directory synchronization. So putting dir sync and password sync into play, this is really when you're starting to do the integration with your on-premises environment. So the policy or the pilot phase is really about checking out the features of Office 365 and validating that they meet their needs, but it's the deployment phase where you start the process of integrating the cloud into your on-premises environment. That's where the changes all start happening. So what is Azure Active Directory dir sync? Now, as a quick side note, we're not really going to talk too much about this in the session, but I did want to point out that when we talk about directory sync and password sync, it's not going to work in all scenarios. For example, dir sync doesn't support two-factor authentication. How many of you are using two-factor authentication in your organization? Okay, a few hands went up. So if you need something like smart card control or any form of two-factor authentication, then instead of dir sync, you would actually need to use Active Directory Federation services. Another reason that you might need ADFS is if you need to use policies that control the places from which clients can log on. That is a key scenario for many customers, particularly those in banking industries and medical industries and some other industries where they have strict policies that control the origins of where client logons can be initiated. So for example, we have some customers that don't allow any external access to their deployments. And so for those customers, they would have to use ADFS in order to get the level of authentication that they need. And so when they move to the cloud, they use ADFS and those client policies to control that. And then there is a third scenario. If you do plan on deploying both SharePoint on premises and SharePoint online, and in addition to that, you plan on doing cross-premises searching, there would be another scenario where you would need ADFS and dir sync would not be sufficient. But let's talk about what WAD dir sync is. Again, WAD is Windows Azure Active Directory dir sync. It's an application. It's an application that synchronizes your on-premises Active Directory with Office 365. It's basically designed as a software-based appliance, which means that you configure it and then you leave it alone. Typically, if this were in the US, I would use the phrase set it and forget it. There's a famous commercial in the United States that uses that phrase. But basically, that's what you do. You configure it, you set it up, and then you just let it do its thing. And it will just synchronize in the background as needed. And it syncs automatically using a service account, so there may be some service account management that you need to do, but by and large, it is meant to run autonomously and on its own. It's an x64 version, so you need the x64 version of Windows to install it on, and it's based on Forefront Identity Manager 2010. And it does also come bundled with SQL Server Express Edition, SQL Server 2012 Express Edition as well. So it's got everything you need right in that one application. So its primary purpose is really there to enable coexistence between your on-premises environment and Office 365. And it does that by provisioning objects in Office 365 that get the same email address as the objects in your on-premises environment. And once an object has been created in Office 365, then you can assign license to it, then you can provision services and features for it, and then that user can log on and start using those things. It also does enable coexistence with Exchange in both simple and hybrid deployments, and it does that by providing things like a unified global address list, a shared domain namespace for email routing, et cetera, et cetera. And it does, as I mentioned earlier, it does enable coexistence for Link and access control for SharePoint Online as well. Now, keep in mind, though, that DirSync is a one-way sync from on-premises to Office 365. So if you do create new objects in the cloud that don't exist on on-premises, they simply will not appear in your global address list. So keep that in mind. You'll really be doing your management still with your on-premises Active Directory. Now, DirSync also enables you to manage users and groups and contacts as well. So, for example, if you delete a synced object from your on-premises Active Directory, that object is also going to be deleted from the Windows Azure Active Directory as well. And DirSync, as I mentioned earlier, it's the primary enabler for the single sign-on functionality. So once you move beyond step 2, the deployment phase, into step 3, what we would call the enhanced phase, if you find that you need, that you do have a need for something like Active Directory Federation services or some form of federated identities, you're already very well situated, because in both those scenarios, DirSync is an underlying requirement for those. So you'll be all set up for that. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, that even though it can work that way, it's not designed to be a one-time bulk import. There are customers who've come to us and said, I turned on DirSync, I replicated all of my objects into Office 365, and then I turned off DirSync, and I was done bulk uploading my users into the cloud. And yeah, it does work that way, and you can do that if you need to. But if you do that, you do give up the ability to do the management from your on-premises AD. Any additions, any modifications, any deletions that you do, they would simply not be replicated up to the cloud. So we typically don't recommend using DirSync in that fashion. And I point that out again because, you know, like many software applications that we create here at Microsoft, there are going to be some customers that will find unintended uses for it and be very happy and satisfied with that. But again, DirSync is not really meant to be this one-time bulk import. It's meant to just continuously run in the background and provide you with ongoing directory synchronization without requiring you to do management from two places or move your management paradigm from your on-premises organization to the cloud. All right, so let's look a little bit deeper at synchronization. So the DirSync appliance that you'll install today, they synchronize one AD forest to Office 365. And by default, all user, group, and mail-enabled contact objects in that forest are going to be synced. But you do have some control. You can create filters to control what gets synced, and these filters can be based on things like OUs, domains, or even user attributes. Again, we've got a large amount of information on TechNet that will help you configure those filters if that's something that you need to do. I've gone ahead and included the link for that in the notes section for this particular slide. Now, password synchronization, as I mentioned, is also available. And it's relatively new, just less than a year old easily, and nothing new or extra is needed. It's all bundled in the same single application that you'll download. Hopefully, you're tracking through that DirSync wiki that has been set up. You're tracking all the versions of DirSync that we have, and the change log that we publish on that wiki, and the version information that we have as well. And I would recommend that because we do fairly aggressive maintenance on this tool. And so you will want to, even though it's basically set it and forget it, you still want to periodically visit that wiki and verify that you're running the latest version. There is a minimum version that is required for DirSync, but that version, like I said, is many months old now. So if you've downloaded and deployed DirSync already, or if you're about to do a deployment and you download the latest version, you're all set. You've already got that password sync functionality. Now, as you can see here, by default, object synchronization happens every 3 hours. Yeah, it does say that. Every 3 hours, but you can always manually kick off sync if you need to for whatever reason, simply by running that start online coexistence sync commandlet. Now, keep in mind, though, that after you do that, whether it's an automatic sync or a manual sync, there's still replication that has to happen within the cloud. Okay? It's not just going to be an instantaneous thing where you kick off DirSync, even if you kick it off manually, and magically everything is replicated in the cloud. It's going to do the time. So remember, when you do a manual sync, you're really synchronizing with the Active Directory web services that we have in the cloud. And those changes then need to replicate to the Windows Azure Active Directory environment. And then beyond that, those changes then need to replicate to the data center in which your tenant is located. So generally, we do document that it takes about 24 hours for those changes to take effect. But to be honest with you, that is really a very conservative value. Typically what we see, it's not a guarantee though, but typically what we see is those changes actually taking effect within about 30 minutes or less. But again, don't bet on the 30 minutes. It's nothing that we can guarantee for you. There's a whole lot of things that happen in the background that need to take place. So we do say, you know, it may take up to 24 hours for that synchronization to replicate everywhere it needs to go. One other thing I wanted to mention, I have mentioned a couple times now that the DirSync process is a one-way sync, and that is generally true. But I say generally because there's an exception. If you are in an Exchange hybrid configuration, we do actually sync back some attributes from the cloud object back into your on-premises objects as well. Things like, you know, the archive mailbox settings, etc. And we simply do that because we have to do that so both systems know where all of the attributes and properties of a given user mailbox, where they exist and so forth. So by and large part, it is a one-way sync, but there are a few things in Exchange hybrid mode that will get synced back. It's a very small set of properties, but there is some two-way traffic that goes on there. Now, from a user object perspective, your on-premises mailbox-enabled users and mail-enabled users, they're synced to Office 365 as mail-enabled users. So whether they have a mailbox or just an SMTP address, they're going to end up as a mail-enabled user inside of Office 365. And we do that for obvious reasons. We want the mailbox to exist only in one location. You wouldn't want the same mailbox to exist in multiple places. And so DirSync basically effectively prevents you from doing that, from getting a split-brain mailbox where you've got the same mailbox existing in two different services. And it will rely on the migration tools that you'll use later on to basically move the data into the mailbox that will ultimately get created in that cloud service. Now, once the objects have been synchronized, they're visible in Office 365 unless you've marked them as hidden, or unless for some reason you are using very rigorous access control policies on your user objects that actually prevents the DirSync tool from seeing these objects. Typically, we see that for customers who have completely separated management of their Active Directory and their Exchange environments. Out of curiosity, is anybody in an organization that does that? Completely separate AD and Exchange management? One person, okay. So for those of you who don't do that, that shouldn't be a problem. If you are doing that, or if you're a consultant and you run into customers who are doing that, there may be some changes that you need to make inside of Active Directory to allow the DirSync tool to be able to see those objects so that it can synchronize them to the cloud. Anything that the DirSync tool cannot access, and of course, as I said, anything that is marked as hidden, simply does not get synchronized. Let's see. So your synchronized users will have logon enabled, but they're not automatically licensed to any services. Okay, so that means that, yes, they'll be able to log on, but they're not going to be able to do anything. They won't be able to access SharePoint or Link or Exchange unless and until you assign them a license. And so if you have users that you just need to synchronize to the cloud for a variety of reasons, but you don't expect them to use any of the services, then in fact they don't need any license and they can just sit there as synchronized cloud objects, again for other purposes like link meetings and access control and so forth. Now, for your non-mailbox and your non-mail-enabled users, in other words, just a regular AD user, those objects are also synced, but they won't come over as mail-enabled users. They will still be synced as regular AD users, and that's how they'll be in Windows Azure AD. They won't be mail-enabled, but again, we still bring them over because you may be using them for provisioning and things like SharePoint or for services within Link as well. Again, as I mentioned, you can filter out what gets synchronized. Now, for group objects, the mail-enabled group objects that you have in your organization, they are synced as mail-enabled group objects, and group membership is also synced as well. If you're using security groups, they're also synced as security groups as well, so no problems there. However, dynamic distribution groups are not synced. And so if you are using those, you actually will need to recreate them in Office 365, but you can do that using either the Exchange Admin Center, or you can do that using PowerShell. Now, for contact objects, only those contact objects that you have that are mail-enabled are going to be synchronized. And just like the mail-enabled users, we're also going to synchronize the target address attribute as well. So all the email addresses you have assigned to those mail-enabled contacts will be synced and preserved as they're moved into the cloud. Now, of course, once DirSync is in place, any new user or any new group or any new mail-enabled contact object that you add to your on-premises AD, those will automatically get synced and added to Office 365. But again, as I mentioned before, licenses will not get automatically assigned to them. The administrator will always have control as to what licenses are assigned to those users. Now, for synced object, if you modify any of the attributes on premises, those modifications are also synced to Office 365 as well. But keep in mind, though, that not all on-premises attributes will get synced. We do have a list. You can actually read that KB, and that KB documents the complete list of the on-premises attributes that end up getting synced to Office 365. Anything that is not on that list does not get synced to Office 365, so keep that in mind. And the same thing applies to object deletion. If you delete an object from your on-premises AD and that object is deleted, if you delete it from your on-premises AD, that object will also be deleted from your on-premises, from your Office 365 objects as well. So similarly, if you disable an object on-prem, that object becomes disabled in Office 365 as well. So basically anything that you're going to do to manipulate these objects will get synchronized up to the cloud. One thing, though, there is a caveat with disabled objects. When you disable an object on premises, that will also sync to the cloud and that object will be disabled. However, any licenses assigned to that object do not get automatically unassigned. So if you do plan on disabling objects, go ahead and unassign the license first before you do that, and then go ahead and disable the object. That'll be your easiest path to deal with that. Now, in terms of the sync process itself, after you install DirSync, the very first time synchronization is done, it's a full and complete sync of all of those objects that I've described. Now, this can be time-consuming depending on the number of objects that you have in your directory. Now, generally, your mileage may vary, but generally what we've seen is we end up syncing about 5,000 objects per hour, or maybe around 50,000 objects in a 24-hour period. Again, that will be varied based on a variety of metrics, your network bandwidth, the load that might be on the web service that you're syncing to, the load that might be behind the web service in terms of replicating that data to Windows Azure AD, and then, of course, the load based on replicating that data into your tenant's data center as well. So if you have tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of objects, then you're definitely going to want to plan ahead because it's going to take some time to get all of that information synchronized up into the cloud. Now, if you plan on creating filters, and again, you can filter by OU, by domain, or by user attributes, then you'll see when we walk through some of the DirSync screenshots, there's a checkbox there that says, go ahead and do the initial sync. In that case, if you're filtering, you don't want to do that initial sync. So you'll uncheck that box because you'll need to create the filters first, and then you'll manually do the initial sync after that. And then after that first full sync, every single subsequent sync is what we would call a delta sync. In other words, only the changes that have been made in your directory will get synced. So it's a much, much faster process. But again, it's still going to take time for replication to occur within the cloud structure itself. Now, there's two ways in which we correlate, or what we would call matching up synchronized objects. So one way is what we would call a hard match, and that's based on the object GUID attribute in AD. And the value for that attribute ends up getting assigned to the value of another attribute called the immutable ID attribute when that object is initially synced. So that's what we would call a hard match. The other way is what we would call a soft match, and that's based on the primary SMTP address assigned to the object. And so that soft match is there as sort of a preventive mechanism. So say, for example, something tragically has happened to your DirSync appliance. Maybe the server died, or for whatever reason, you ended up with some sort of software corruption or some problem that required you to have to reinstall DirSync. That's the reason that we have the soft matching capabilities, so that if you do a reinstall of DirSync, or in case you initiate a manual full sync again, which would be another case, then we can do a soft match and match up those user IDs in a very quick fashion. And the way we do that refers to what we would call the source of authority. It's that is the source that determines what that object is, who owns it, and really what it's matched with between the cross-premises environment. And again, when you download this deck, I've given you links that explain what the source of authority is and the mechanisms by which we do the hard and soft matches. Now, previously, and this has changed, but previously, after your first 50,000 objects were synced, we used to make you have to open up a support ticket and request an increase to your sync quota. You don't have to do that anymore. Now, you only need to do that if you are syncing more than 300,000 objects. If you are syncing 300,000 or fewer objects, you no longer need to request an increase in quota. We will automatically increase the sync limit from that 50,000 limit to the 300,000 limit once you have put in and validated any SMTP vanity domains that you might be using for your service. Once that domain has been verified, that automatically happens in the background, and there's nothing that you need to do to take care of that. Now, of course, if you need more than 300,000, though, you will need to open up a support ticket and request a quota increase. Once you have reached your limit, whether it's the 300,000 limit or whether it's something higher because you got a quota increase, synchronization is going to stop, and we're going to send an email message to the designated technical contact for your tenant. And by the way, as an aside, when we talk about the technical contact for your tenant, typically what we recommend is if you're in a medium to large organization with multiple administrators, you would want to use a distribution group for that contact so that multiple admins can be aware of it. You can, of course, if you're in a small organization or if you really do just have a single contact, you can use a single user SMTP address, admin SMTP address, but generally we'd recommend that you use a group. Now, one thing else to keep in mind, for deleted objects, they will count against your quota for up to 30 days. And that's because we have a garbage collection process where we preserve, by default, deleted objects for 30 days. After 30 days, the garbage collection process runs, and those things are released from your quota, and they no longer count against it. But also keep in mind that And I'm not sure the reason for this, but there is actually what we would call a 4-to-1 ratio. And that is roughly 4 deleted objects are equivalent to 1 object. I suspect it has something to do with the compression and compaction that we use for deleted objects and the mechanism we use to store them in the pre-garbage collection phase. But so what that means is just because you deleted one object and then 30 days later it's gone, now you can add another object in its place. No, you can't. It's a 4-to-1 ratio, so if you are at your limit, you would have to wait till 4 deleted objects are basically purged out of the system before you'll be able to create one additional object in your directory. Now, there is another 50,000 object limit, but that's outside of us, that is present in SQL Server Express Edition. And there's also a limit at about, I think it's around 10 gigabytes. And a 10 gigabyte database can hold around 50,000 objects. If you do have more than 50,000 objects in your Active Directory, that of course then means that you won't be able to use the version of SQL Server Express Edition that comes bundled with DirSync. You will end up having to purchase the full version of SQL Server yourself and use that. And there's simply no way around that. That's just one of the limits that we have in the Express Edition. So again, if you are larger than that, you will have to use the full edition of SQL Server. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the synchronization process is secure. It is an outbound call from the DirSync server up into the cloud, but that is all secured from both an authorization and synchronization standpoint via SSL. So you don't have any worries about somebody sniffing on your network and capturing the traffic and gathering your Active Directory objects for themselves. Now, if there are any errors that occur during synchronization, once again, that tenant's technical contact will get that email about that. And like I said before, for the larger organizations or for any organization that has multiple administrators, we're going to recommend that you use a distribution group with all of those administrators for your technical contact. That will be the best practice that we have documented, and it'll be the best way to make sure that somebody gets notified right away that there's a problem that needs to be addressed by the on-premises administrator. So some of the errors that you might see are things related to the health of synchronization or objects that have invalid characters, although we'll talk about how to prevent that from happening in a little bit, or objects that have duplicate or conflicting email addresses, or like I said earlier, when your sync quota has been reached, you will get an email in that regard as well. So let's look at the actual sync process here. Over on the blue side, or if you're colorblind, on this side, we have your on-premises environment. And then over there on the red side, we've got Office 365. So we've got AD and Exchange running on premises, and now we've introduced that DirSync compliance that I've been talking about. And over on the Office 365 side, we've got the Windows Azure Active Directory and that provisioning web service that's used to not only gather the data, but also to authenticate your DirSync server as well. So the first thing that we do as part of the sync cycle is we import the users and groups and contacts that are in your on-prem AD, and we import them into that DirSync compliance. Next, we're going to do a sync cycle from Office 365, where we'll actually import objects from Windows Azure Active Directory into your DirSync compliance. Now, this is really only relevant if you've actually created some objects in Office 365 during your pilot phase. If you haven't done this, then really nothing's going to happen during this cycle. But we do that anyway, just to see if there are objects that you have up in the cloud that we might need to sync back into your DirSync compliance. And that will also be the case if you've set up a vanity domain as well. So you've changed the logon for those objects from the onmicrosoft.com SMTP domain to whatever vanity domain that you're using. And we do this just to make sure that we're not duplicating any objects inside of Office 365. If we do, as I mentioned earlier, if we do find duplicated objects, we will try a hard match first, and then a soft match after that to try and reconcile that. All right, the third step is exporting those users and the groups and contacts from your DirSync server to the Windows Azure Active Directory server. And then finally, as I mentioned before, if you are in an Exchange hybrid mode, there is that fourth step that we'll do where we do write back some attributes from Office 365 back into your on-premises organization. This will only happen if you're in a hybrid configuration. If you're not in a hybrid configuration, that stage 4 sync cycle will be skipped. So at this point, using one object as an example, this object that you see right there, you have a user object on premises that is mailbox enabled with, in this case, a proxy address of john.doe at contoso.com. And that object will be synchronized to Office 365 as a logon enabled user that is also mail enabled with multiple proxy addresses and a target address that matches the on-premises, their primary on-premises SMTP address. And by the way, in case you're not sure, the primary SMTP address is the one in uppercase where it says SMTP in uppercase. The other ones that have SMTP in lowercases, those would be the proxy addresses. Now, once that object exists in Windows Azure Active Directory, then at that point, all of the workloads start to provision things on their behalf using what we would call a backsync process. So the authentication platform that we have, that's based on the Microsoft Federation Gateway. It does a pull of all of the objects from Windows Azure Active Directory so that it can authenticate users from a logon perspective. And then Exchange Online, the next one down, will do a pull for all mail-enabled users and all mail-enabled groups and all mail-enabled contacts. And we do that so that we can create a unified global address list. Then the next one down, SharePoint Online, it'll pull all of the AD objects and all of the group objects so that it can give you a list of those objects in the SharePoint People Picker so that you can assign permissions to them. And the last one down there, Link Online, that will also pull all of the user objects out of WAAD for link services as well. Now again, this process will occur within the data center in which your tenant is located. And generally, as I said, it will run within about 30 minutes. One thing that can delay it, though, is if we have some sort of load issue and we need to fail over that service to somewhere else, then the backsync process will actually have to start again from the beginning. But that would be something that we did. It wouldn't be anything that you would be doing wrong on your end. It would just be, we had a need to fail over. We're sorry about that, but we've got to start from the beginning again. So it is possible it could perhaps be as long as an hour before an object is fully synchronized and pulled into all these services on our back end. Generally, again, it will take place in about 30 minutes. But again, if a failover takes place, that's going to reset the clock, and that means another 30 minutes. So less than an hour. All right, let's talk a little bit about password synchronization next. So password synchronization, as I mentioned, that was introduced with DirSync. You can go to that website and download it. It's DirSync version 6385.12 or later, again from last May, so it's fairly old at this point, that has the password sync capabilities in it. There's nothing special that you need to do. That's something that will happen automatically once you have that version installed and configured. And again, the benefits of using password sync is they do make, for many customers, a very viable alternative to federated identities, depending on what sort of federated authentication needs that you have. That means, though, again, without having to use something like ADFS, you get the single sign-on experience so that your users can simply use their on-prem username and password to access everything that you're giving to them, both on-prem and cloud-based services. In addition to that link, again, there's another link in the notes section of the slide that has the link to the wiki, where we have basically a full and complete change history for the DirSync tool, so that you'll know what was fixed in the latest version and what you might need to do to get to that version. Now, the password sync process itself, it doesn't require a plain text password. It doesn't have access to the plain text password. It doesn't have any security implications around that whatsoever. The user's password hash actually is rehashed using non-reversible encryption. And that turns it into a digest, and it's that digest that ends up getting synced into Windows Azure AD. And that digest cannot be used in any way whatsoever to access on-premises services. So it is a very secure mechanism that is really not open to vulnerabilities or hacking or anything like that. It's really, if someone were to get a hold of that digest somehow, which is almost impossible, but even if they were able to do that, it would be completely useless for them from an attack point of view. Now again, as I mentioned, we're doing a one-way sync from on-premises AD to the cloud. So any password policies that you might have in place in your on-premises AD are still going to apply. Now, the default password expiration setting in Windows Azure Active Directory is going to be set to never expire. So that means that any password expiration and sync in Windows Azure AD is always driven by your on-premises policies. So you may see some discrepancies there. In fact, I've seen a few customers point that out now, how the password settings between the two don't seem to be the same. But again, that's largely irrelevant because it's always driven by your on-premises password policies. So it doesn't matter that it says never expire in Windows Azure because it's going to be your on-premises policy, which might be set to expire, that is always going to drive password behavior based on your on-premises events.
So subsequently, if you were to disable DRSync, will the password policy still be never expired?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. I would have to look that up. I'll send me an email on that, and I'll find an answer for you. The question was, so if you disable DRSync, is that still true? Will the password policies in Windows Azure Active Directory still take their cue from the password policies on premises? And yeah, so the answer was, I don't know, and I'll have to find out for him. And if you also are curious in that, again, feel free to send me an email on that, and I'll send the answer out to all of you. Yes, sir?
Does Windows Azure AD actually care about the password policy, or does it just get synced because the user has changed its password because the on-prem AD required it to change?
Right, so the question is, does Windows Azure AD actually care about the password policy, or doesn't it matter if the user has just changed their password on premises? Really, the short answer is it still has its setting, but it's nothing that's going to be enforced because the password policy from on-premises will override anything that Windows Azure AD has been set to.
Actually, if someone then to go on vacation and their password would expire on-prem,
Correct.
still access Office 365 service?
No, if their password is expired on premises, then it's effectively expired in Office 365 as well.
And because of the one-way sync, you cannot change the password in OA, so they would have to VPN back home to change that password.
Yes, that's right. Because of the one-way sync, you're still doing all of your management, and that's true for the admin, and that's true for the end user from your on-premises environment. So if they are expired, you're right, they would not be able to log on to Outlook web app in Exchange Online to do that.
And it could also take up to an hour before, let's say, a user logs on to your desktop, they get a message that your password has expired, you change the password, they log on, you start Outlook.
Yes, there could be a delay in that because of the synchronization process. That's right. Passwords, like every other thing that we change, has the same synchronization schedule. So even if you manually kick off a sync, it could still take up to 30 minutes for that to make its way into Windows Azure AD inside your data center. That's a great point. Right. Yeah, depending on the synchronization rate. That's right. All right, so let's have a look at the DRSync installation and configuration process here. Okay, so I'm just going to walk you through adding a managed domain using the Microsoft Online Portal. I imagine that there's probably some of you in this room who have already gone through this process, so I'm not going to take too much time, but I did want you to see basically how simple it is. You log on to the portal. Boom, we're logged in now. That's what the admin portal looks like if you haven't seen this before. You'll select the users and groups that you want, and then you will activate a DRSync. And remember, it can take some time for DRSync to be activated on the Office 365 site. It's not going to be an immediate thing, so here's another example where you'll want to plan ahead. So you'll select the users and groups, click Setup Active Directory Synchronization. You'll go to step 3. You will activate that after you've done things like verify your domains. And then at that point, we always give you this dialog that says, are you sure you want to activate it, just in case you accidentally clicked on it and you didn't mean to. We want to just verify that for you real quick. So here you would click activate once more, and then you would wait up to 24 hours for DirSync to be enabled on the back end as well. And again, it's not always going to be 24 hours, but we're trying to be conservative here and set expectations so that if it does end up taking a little bit longer than perhaps we might expect, it doesn't cause frustration or confusion on your part. So you wait for that to be enabled. Once it is enabled, by the way, you will get a notification of that, so you don't have to just keep trying over and over. Once it is enabled, then you'll hopefully read all of our documentation and then follow the implementation steps, and then you'll go and download the DirSync tool. And by default, that download will always be the latest version of that tool, which of course is what we recommend that you're on. All right, once you're ready to do that, now you're ready to install DirSync. It installs just like about any other application you've ever installed throughout the history of Windows. You're going to get the welcome box. You'll follow the setup wizard. Obviously, you have to accept the license agreement. You'll select a path for it. There's very few reasons where you would change the default path. It will go ahead and install the components. It won't take too long, but remember again, we're doing things like installing SQL Server Express, and so there's more than just installing the lightweight directory sync tool that's happening on the box at this point. Installation will be complete. You can start the configuration wizard, and then at that point, you're ready to run through yet another set of dialogues where the wizard gets configured. You'll provide your credentials for Office 365. These would be your admin credentials. You'll provide your on-premises AD admin credentials. And again, all of these are secured, so you don't have to worry about them being hacked or stolen from this DirSync appliance. If you're in Exchange Hybrid, you would have to check that Enable Hybrid deployment, and that will trigger that write-back process that I talked about earlier. And then we also recommend for those customers who want single sign-on to go ahead and enable that password sync checkbox as well. Now here, it'll go ahead and create the initial configuration. It'll validate the credentials in the background and start setting everything up. And then once the configuration is complete, you'll get that option that says synchronize your directories now. Now here again, that's that checkbox I was talking about earlier. If you're going to create filters so that not everything gets synced, so if you're not syncing a subset of users, or if you don't want to sync an entire OU or a whole domain, or if you don't want to sync a partial set of user attributes, you must uncheck that box. Because if you don't uncheck that box, if you just click finish, it's doing a full sync of all of those objects that I described earlier. So that's the key there. We've actually been going back and forth as to whether or not that box should be checked by default, but we decided to make it easiest for the majority of customers who will be using this, which will choose to synchronize everything. So for now, that checkbox will be checked by default. Just remember to uncheck it if you plan on creating filters before you click finish. All right. Now it is 2:15, so before we get into the rest of it, we can go ahead and take a 15-minute break, and we will resume here again at 2:30, and then from 2:30 to 3:30, we'll go ahead and finish the rest of the presentation.